it's the first, in fact. So welcome to the first of our Citizens of the World in Conversation. That's what we're calling the series. And the idea of the series is to bring together people from all over the world, who, creative types and activist types, and some people who sit in the middle of that Venn diagram, to talk about their work and what they do, which we hope will give people a chance to take away new perspectives on life, discover new things. So this is the very first one. We're very, very excited to have Danny speaking. Of course, it is a fundraiser in some sense for us, 1,000 for 1,000. So we do. I mean, the events are absolutely free because knowledge is free, but we do really encourage you to say thank you by making a donation to the charity, which you can do on the website, or even better, signing up to our Cup of Kindness campaign to help make homes. Our core purpose as a charity was set up to be a charity that made homes for displaced people here in Brighton. These are the people, of course, that have been people. If you find yourself in that situation because you've been a target of the UK's hostile environment, I mean, I don't need to tell you guys, I'm sure, that the UK state makes it a criminal offence for people without papers to work. It makes it a criminal offence to rent homes to somebody without status. You're not allowed any access to mainstream welfare benefits, and so of course you're being made homeless by those policies simply for the non-crime of crossing a border, and that's a kind of state purpose. And we said, as a collective, we said we can't have that. This is not our politics. This is not our community. This is not who we are. And so we in some sense put a challenge out to the community. Said we can come together as a community, and everybody can contribute whatever they can afford. Initially we said £1. That's why the name 1,000 for 1,000. But now we realise we kind of need a little bit more, because people who give you £1 are likely to give you 3, and people who won't give you 3 aren't going to give you 1. So we're now thinking price per cup of coffee out of our small change. The point is what people can afford to bring people in to make homes for people in Brighton. So that's what we do, and you're very, very welcome, if you don't already, to support us by going to the website and signing up. Before I introduce Hanna and Danny, I'll just say a little bit about the format. We're going to hear some questions from Hanna to Danny, who's going to answer them. You've got it's your chance as well. You have a chance to, and you're encouraged to, please do ask questions, which you can do either by sticking it in the chat, or if you prefer, you can put up your hand and we'll keep an eye out for you. I mean, a physical hand, that is, not I mean, you can use the Zoom hand too, but that's complicated. And we'll take your questions, and you can ask Danny what you want to know. So Hanna is one of our volunteers, but is going to be doing the interviewing. But she's also, we're so lucky, a wonderful, as well as being a brilliant activist, she's a wonderful creative person, and makes a costume maker, and is also a writer. Is currently studying for a PhD in creative writing, and so she's going to be asking the questions to Danny. She's a big fan of his work, as am I. And Danny Ramadan is a Syrian Canadian author and LGBTQ refugees advocate. His debut novel, The Clothesline Swing, won the Independent Publisher Book Award, the Canadian Authors Award, and was shortlisted for Evergreen Award, Sunburst Award, and a Lambda Award, which is an awful lot of awards. The novel is translated to French, German, and Hebrew. His children's books, Salma the Syrian Chef, is nominated to the Forest of Reading's Blue Spruce Award and named among the best books of 2020 by Kirkus Reviews and Library School Journal. It won the Middle East Book Award 2020. His forthcoming novel, which I think is going to be out quite soon now, The Foghorn Echoes, is to be released by Penguin Canada and Canongate UK in summer 2022. So Danny graduated from UBC with an MFA in creative writing and lives in Vancouver with his husband, Matthew Ramadan. So yes, please welcome Hanna and Danny.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That was great. Welcome everyone. It's so lovely to be here. And I am palpably excited to be talking with Danny tonight, who is one of my favourite authors. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine told me that I must read The Clothesline Swing. And what a recommendation. Danny's novel is artfully constructed, heartbreaking, and resplendent with exquisite poetic prose. It perfectly captures the realities of living with PTSD and the impact migration has on close relationships. So Danny, thank you so much for coming tonight, and welcome. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, throughout The Clothesline Swing, one time period and location slips into another, and backwards, so that the reader is presented with a cleverly woven and complex narrative. How does your writing process tackle such an intricate network of times and places?
Well, thank you very much, firstly, Hannah, for inviting me, and thank you, Jacob, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. When I joined 10 minutes ago, Jacob was like having this like fanboy moment of his own, and like being like, "Oh my God, I'm talking to you," and I'm like, "Dude, I have no idea. Like, calm down. I don't think of myself as a professional author yet, and I do it for." I would say that I want to thank you, and I really appreciate the invitation to be part of this event, and to also support and celebrate this cause that you folks are working on. Now, to go into your question, to be honest, I have two answers for you. In regards to The Clothesline Swing specifically, when I wrote The Clothesline Swing, I didn't actually think about structure at all. The Clothesline Swing was written between 2012 and 2015 in a time of change in my life itself. I just left Syria. I just became a Syrian refugee in Lebanon. And then 2 years later, I moved into this brand new world that is Vancouver, where I live right now. And as I was writing, I was honestly, I didn't even know if this book is going to be published, let alone be read by anybody else other than me. So I just sat there and wrote, and I promise you that the structure that you see in The Clothesline Swing is something that came from page 1 to page 280. I didn't plan it at all. I didn't think about it. Over the last 6 months or so, I was reading The Clothesline Swing because I was recording the audio book for The Clothesline Swing, and I sat down with myself, and I was extremely critical of the work that I did on The Clothesline Swing. I thought that while I appreciated this airy feel of the book, this outwardly feel of the book, I was worried about the impact of it on the reader themselves. The book is really traumatic, and I wrote it during the time that I was traumatized. So I worried about what am I leaving in the book and what kind of messages I was delivering in the book. Which takes me to my next answer. So for The Foghorn Echoes, my next book, I sat down and I created a sketch. Like I actually I sat down with my mentor. We had this whiteboard, and I literally drew lines and connections, because also like it's non-linear, it's mixed, it's two narratives in one, The Foghorn Echoes. So I literally drew lines and shapes and boxes, and it was a thing. Until I had the narrative all together in front of me. And now that I know this timeline, that I know this narrative, I felt more comfortable jumping around that narrative while holding that space for the reader to feel safe jumping around with me.
That's so fascinating, because I had really imagined you to have meticulously planned the plot for The Clothesline Swing, because you've collected these fragments that are all so linked, and you can see so many aspects that are linked throughout, the different stories and the different timelines and the different places, and there's so many like recurring motifs. And I guess that really speaks of the fragmentation of trauma, doesn't it? And how you sort of piece yourself back together in some sense, or become a new person in some way.
I completely agree with that. I completely agree with that. And I think, so I did an exercise a couple of years ago where I brought post-it notes and I read the clothesline swing, and every time that I mentioned like an event in a timeline, I actually wrote on the post-it note, like, he moved from this house to this house when he was 22, and I would put that post-it note on the timeline. When I finished the book, that timeline made no sense. There was a lot of overlapping. There was a lot of events that happened here that didn't actually make sense in an overall linear narrative. But isn't that how memory worked to begin with? Specifically traumatized memory, when you're like in a much older space, somebody who's much older looking back at their life, they're not going to remember their life chronologically. They're not going to remember their life. They're not going to share the story of their life, specifically to a lover who knows that story of their life. They're not going to be able to share this life in a chronological order. They just will give you fragmented storytelling, and some of it might not be a reliable narration, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and you really get a sense of that sort of unreliable narration, and I suppose that's an aspect of traumatic memory, well, two aspects, in that it lives with you simultaneously alongside, so it's never like put back in the past. It's not about the past, it's living with you at that moment, right? But then also like the questioning of the traumatic narrator, of you being your own unreliable narrator, of you being your own unreliable narrator.
That's and again, like when you are in a traumatic space, and when you're dealing specifically with post-traumatic stress disorder, which, by the way, like I'm forthcoming by saying that I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder in 2017. So you question what happened, you underplay it yourself, you tell the stories in a different platform, in a different way. You don't remember certain details, and then you add your own details, and that's your brain protecting you, really. That is the way your head is saving you from actually facing the truth under like one big mosaic, and just showing you, shining light onto this piece or that piece, or adding its own coloring to the past that you have, I guess.
Right. So in a way, storytelling is an aspect of dissociating, isn't it? Because you're removing yourself from the reality and embellishing it in some way. So
I mean, storytellers are definitely the biggest liars when it comes to their own truth. I'm more concerned of telling you what is real over what is true. I'm more interested in telling you the narrative of a real life experience and how that is presented, rather than telling you the truth of that life experience, or the truth of a specific lived experience, be it my own or somebody else's.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and you can really feel that truth in the novel throughout. So let's sort of stay with this this sort of thought of narrative dexterity for a moment, and talking about storytelling. And the narrator is called Hakawati, which in Arabic means storyteller, for anyone that doesn't know. So could you talk a little bit about storytelling, the significance of storytelling in Syria and for Syrian refugees?
Mm-hmm. It's a very traditional thing for us to have storytelling as a way of sharing our history, as a way of sharing our culture and heritage. Hakawati is an actual profession in Syria. So you go to a cafe and there's a Hakawati, a storyteller, and his job is to sit on this high chair and then tell you a good story. And part of the experience is that you have to react to the story. So as the Hakawati is telling you a good story, and how like I don't know, the hero is getting stabbed in the side and by his lover, by his ex-lover who turned out to betray him. You have to be like, oh, what a shame. You have to respond to the storyteller. And it feels very organic. It feels very authentic, to be honest, to my culture. So that's one thing. And the other thing, to be honest, is that we are denied as Syrians, we are denied our own history. From a political perspective, the Syrian regime came around the 1970s, and part of their way of keeping this image of them as the savior of the Syrian people and giving legitimacy to their ruling, they limited our access to our own history. So for example, Syria was the first country in the Middle East to have a democratic election in the 1940s after the French occupation ended. But you don't learn about that in Syrian schools. You don't learn about that in Syrian history because as a dictatorship, they did not want you to know that in the 1940s and 50s, we had fair democratic elections in Syria with multiple parties. So that meant that our personal storytelling, the storytelling between generations, between ancestors and grandchildren, where we are sharing who we are, our truth, be it with actual real life stories or by mixing fable and mixing angels and ghosts and ghouls and genies and witches into our narrative, so we can tell a truthful story of who we are, even in a time where a dictatorship is telling us that our history is being muted away from us. And then you have the Syrian refugee crisis, where people are leaving their homes, unable to grab with them their family photos, their family trees, unable to grab with them the keys to their apartments or the book that was inherited from a grandfather. That leaves only this vocal oral history for us to keep. We don't have access to physical history to keep with us when you're escaping for your life from a civil war.
That sort of erasure and the sort of denial of history and that sort of leads me on to a question that I was going to ask a bit later about magical realism in Latin America, and I wonder if I could fuse these questions together, if you don't mind. So I mean, at the beginning of the book you have a quote by Gabriel Garcia Marquez from 100 Years of Solitude, and I was going to read it out, but I'm not going to, because you speak so beautifully about your work. But I just wanted to touch more on that point of how influenced you are by magical realism. I mean, the core elements of magical realism of sort of a history that's denied, and having that sort of oral sense of having to speak your story. I wonder if you could speak about how influenced you are by magical realism, more specifically Latin American magical realism, if you are at all.
Oh yeah. So I would say that I have had an undeniable crush on Gabriel Garcia Marquez for for all of my life, and to be honest, as his history is extremely layered, like he's a political person as well, so there are some things that I disagree with him from a political point of view. There are some actions that he did that I'm like, but then you read his art and the way that he tells a story, and you just fall in love with every sentence that he creates. His ability to write a third-person ominous perspective, telling you the stories of 100 characters. Half of them have their same name, like literally 50 people have the same name in the 100 Years of Solitude. and still you'll be able to distinguish those people from one another just because he writes so beautifully and so specifically and detailed, with details that are insane. So Gabriel Garcia Marquez, of course, continues to be such an inspiration. I read 100 Years of Solitude for fun, which my husband thinks is crazy because the book is like this big, but every like 6 months or so, I'm like, I just need 100 Years of Solitude again.
I feel the same.
Yeah, so I'm definitely influenced by him. However, I have come, over the last couple of years, I have come to distaste the term magic realism. I think as we, specifically as myself as an author of color, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez also being an author of color, we write from our traditions, we write from our history. The way that my father talked about his grandfather included the grandfather meeting an angel in the street, and that was not magic realism. My father wasn't trying to be magical like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He's a blue-collar working man. He never read Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but he tells the story with complete conviction that my grandfather, his grandfather, my great-grandfather, met an actual angel in the street. And that's part of the conversations we have in our traditions, in our heritage, in the way that people think over there. And I understand that like there is a push in British literature, in Canadian literature, in American literature towards this like realism, towards this like specific and detail oriented and like hung on the moment and get everything you can out of it and show the dirt in the streets in a way. Specifically in the 90s and early 2000s, there is a move towards magic realism more often right now in newer fiction, which is amazing. But I think that there is a major difference between writing from your heritage, writing because this is the way your story is being told, this is who you are as a writer, and between intentionally writing magic realism. I completely believe in that separation. And when I wrote The Clothesline Swing, I wrote from my heritage, quite influenced by magic realism, that's for sure. So the scene where Death takes the characters into a trip to show them those stories of survival, that's a moment of magic realism, that's for sure. That is typical 101 magic realism. But the fact that Death exists right there and just having a conversation with the main character, that is not intended to be magic realism, I don't think. That is just Death, the angel, just decided, you know what, I'm going down and hanging out with those two people.
That's really interesting. And I think that, I mean, that's the, I'm so sorry to use the term magical realism as you stated that, but I guess that's the kind of the difference between surrealism and magical realism in Latin America, is that what did really come from their own experience rather than a dreamt up experience or something coming, you know, releasing the subconscious or the unconscious, not unconscious even. So, yeah.
Well, think about Gabriel Garcia Marquez for a second. In 100 Years of Solitude, the most beautiful woman in the narrative, and I just read the book, so I have it in the back of my head. The most beautiful woman in the narrative, every man in the village tries to sneak into her bedroom, but they're all like denied by her. And then one day she is outside by the clotheslines putting white laundry. And then Gabriel Garcia Marquez tells you that angels came from the sky and whisked her up into the skies and flew her away. And that's the end of her story. But when Gabriel Garcia Marquez talked about, in one of his lectures, talked about the scene specifically, he said that's how traditional villages in Colombia, I believe, when a woman escapes with a lover, destroying the honor of the family, that is how that family would say that the woman escaped with a lover. So they will just say, oh, angels came from the sky and whisked her away and she's gone. But so so that scene specific, there's a lot of magic realism again in 100 Years of Solitude, but that scene specifically, I really don't think it's magic realism. It's just representative of how a culture think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there's a particular phrase in the Clothesline Swing where you say it's something to do with being arrested, and there's a phrase of, oh, he's gone to see his aunt or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it is. Yeah,
he's going to his aunt's house. Yeah. So that's also it. A culture has coding for what it really means, and the fact that we as authors are using this social cue doesn't mean that we are literally sending our character to our aunt's home. We are allowing the character. We're allowing a feather of our culture into the headscarf of the book. I have no idea where I was going with this metaphor. Let's ask the next question.
Sure. Okay. Well, I thought maybe we could go on to your reading, but before you do, I just wanted to remind our lovely audience tonight to put their questions into the chat if they have any, and I can read them out, or you can ask them yourselves with the raised hand after Danny's reading.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
Go for it, Danny.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your questions, folks. Honestly, I visited London for the first time in my life in 2018, I believe. I hanged out in the UK for a while because the book got published in the UK, and it just dawned on me because I was like, it was my first travel as a Canadian. So as a Syrian, you would never ever dream of crossing a border and going to a European country. It is so far-fetched for us as Syrians. And then I became Canadian, and it's a Commonwealth country. So I arrived at the airport, and there's a little thing that you wave your passport next to, and they open a door, and then you walk through the door, and then I saw my luggage. And my husband was like, okay, are you moving? I'm like, nobody asked me anything. And he's like, Esther, about what? And I'm like, no customs stopped me. Like, there's no officer telling me, like, what are you doing here? It's like, yeah, you have the passport. I'm like, oh. And then I literally had a moment. Like, I literally was standing there in Heathrow, and I was like, oh, look at how much privilege I have gained over a couple of years. All of that to say, that was a very important moment in my life. And also, I would move to London in a heartbeat. So give me a job there, and I will come and come and live there. It's beautiful.
Come to Brighton. It's better.
Oh, cool! Awesome.
Right. That's where T4K is based. So.
All right, cool. I've never been to Brighton, so I'm sure my husband is a royalist, and he's in love with everything UK. So I know I'm not a big fan personally, but he's definitely, like, if I told him that let's go to Brighton, he'll be like, okay, I already booked our flight. All right. So for today's reading, I'm going to read for a couple of minutes from the first chapter of the Clothesline Swing. I love reading this piece specifically in the book because while there's a background of the Civil War, of explosions and machine guns, this scene is concerned with two boys going at it like rabbits. And I think that two boys in love having sex is one of the most purest ways of resilience. Our morning coffees on my balcony were frequently interrupted by the shouts and screams of army officers and the police, running after another person to arrest. They would pull on the prisoner's shirt and drag him to the ground while the women in his family wailed in agony from their windows, tightening their white scarves upon their heads. The prisoner would be pushed into the trunk of the car under the eyes of gazers, among them you and me, before they locked the trunk on him and drove away. The first time we saw that scene, our hearts bounced, and we hid in my bedroom for 2 hours. After a couple of arrests, We got used to the screaming and the wailing, and we just returned to our morning coffees and turned the radio back on. I lost count of how many times we woke up at 3 a.m. to the sounds of distant explosions coming from the other side of the street. The calm in the city carried the sounds of war swiftly to our ears and woke us up frightened and lonely. You whined one night, half asleep, pulled out of your land of dreams, worrying that the explosions were too close to us. I brushed your hair with my fingers, calming you down. It's fireworks. It's just the sound of fireworks, I whispered, and you went back to sleep. One night, the explosion was just too close. It shook the apartment and woke us both up. We heard the explosion and thought it might have happened right outside our building. It was followed by the sound of machine guns rushing through the streets. We crawled on all fours as we escaped the exposed bedroom for the windowless bathroom. I laid down in the bathroom tub and you rested your body upon mine. Your eyes were wide open like small white dishes. You shivered and started to bite your lips. I got you, I whispered, and hugged you closer until the sound of machine guns morphed into an unrecognizable noise. That night in the tub, I made love to you. I made love to you as if we were reciting poetry about the beauty of Damascus. I woke your senses with opening lines and flirtatious gestures, sneaking into your world like the first drops of sun rays on the mountains of our city. I colored your face with the shades of sunrise as I pulled on your earlobes with my teeth. I roamed the corners of your body like a lost traveler exploring the old sleepy streets of the city, knocking on the doors of your soul with the tips of my fingers like a shy delivery boy knocking on the wooden doors of old homes in Saruja, carrying warm bread and Baladi cheese. I turned your body around and I tickled your feet, and you laughed like a child on a ride in an amusement park. I murmured whispers of pleasure in your ears, like the sighs of an old wooden bridge aching under the pressure of the souls it carried. I joined my body with yours and we moved as we were slipping up and down the hills of the waving roads of our city. I printed breathless kisses on your forehead while I let your body slip away from mine, covered in my bite marks and glorious sweat. By the time we were done, we opened the bathroom door and returned to bed, and the sound of machine guns fire was long gone. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. That was so beautiful. Just lovely and so beautifully read as well. That's one of my favourite sections in the novel, and here's to more gay literature. More gay sex scenes.
I'll get you all the gay literature. Actually, the Foghorn Echoes, the next book, there is a publishing house that responded being like, there's too much gay sex in this book. I'm like, I don't think you're my publishing house.
Well, I very much look forward to that book coming out then.
It's gonna be fun. All right. Okay, so do we have questions, I wonder?
Yeah, so we've got one question from Jacob. Do you want to read it out, Jacob, or shall I?
I don't know. I may as well read it.
Sure.
Well, other people should ask questions. Otherwise, it's me and Hannah's show. But like, so I'm really interested in the moments where you kind of choose to explain Syrian or Middle Eastern politics or tradition, where you know, I've read a bit of reading, looking at it this morning, and there's a bit where you sort of say Hezbollah, and you explain who they are, and those kind of moments jar in some ways. I think, you know, it made me think, why does the narrator need to say that? but then it made me realize it's also making me aware that here's a storyteller. This narrator is a storyteller who is telling a story and telling a story to me. So it kind of, I mean, so it works. I mean, you make it work, I think. But I sort of wonder how you make those technically. I mean, I know nothing about writing, like how you make those decisions. But also, I guess, like how it feels to you that you, as an author, that you kind of have to do that. That there's this kind of, I guess, a sense of a gap between yourself and your audience.
It's a great question, Jacob. It really is. So on a panel, remember those a couple of years ago when actual people would gather around and talk to each other? Yeah, I remember those. On a panel, after a panel, somebody came to me and I was signing books and sitting there and having fun conversations with people who are asking me to sign the book. And one person came to me and she's like, I counted 28 Arabic terms in this book. Why shouldn't there be like an index at the end with translations of those Arabic words? I'm like, lady, I learned a whole fucking language, so I can write this book for you. You can Google 28 words. So it's honestly, it is challenging when you are an author, specifically an author from outside of the quote unquote norm of who gets published and whose voice is being heard, when we have to tell those stories, and we have to tell those stories with intention of not only telling a good story, but teaching the context of that good story. And it feels, honestly, it feels like a lot of work. Sometimes I find myself writing and then midway through, I need to use a line of dialogue and it's beautiful and it's interesting. But if I didn't explain it, if I didn't explain it, it wouldn't make sense to a white person in Dakota reading it, if that makes sense. To give an example, for example, when something makes you happy in English, you say, oh, it warms my heart, right? In Arabic, if something makes you happy, you say it chills, it ices my chest. It's just simple because think about it for a sec. English is a language that was born on your side of the word, where warmth is a great thing. Like, yeah, give me some warmth that will make me happy. While Arabic is born in the middle of the freaking desert. So saying something like, oh, that warms my heart, people will be like, are you okay? Are you having a heat stroke? So it just makes sense to me, but actually explaining this in a narrative just feels troublesome, to be honest. All of that to say that, yes, it is a lot of freaking work and I honestly don't want to do it. But at the same time, I understand that asking every single person of the 20,000 people that I expect to buy the book to know everything about Syrian culture is asking the impossible. And understanding that for authors, for what's her name, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, to be able to write about her challenges as a divorcee, she doesn't need to talk much about that because everybody in North America knows a woman who's a divorcee. So good for her, and that means that my writing is going to be more difficult than hers, but also who doesn't like a challenge? I love to write something that introduces some background to my culture while also telling you a good story. And I think if I mastered that balance, that's when I will win the Booker one day. Maybe even Nobel Prize, who knows? One day.
So we've got a few more questions.
Okay, let's do them.
So Richard says, you talked about telling stories as a way of reclaiming the truth of your history that has been denied by the current Syrian regime. When you write, is there any tension between art and politics? Does the politics ever get in the way of art? So I guess that's kind of on the back of of Jacob's question.
I mean, isn't everything personal is political at the end of the day? When I am a queer Syrian man born in Damascus, where society, religion, and law comes against me and is criminalizing me, then my existence, my core existence is political, because otherwise I would be ignoring that my safety, that my future, my ability to have a calm, safe, peaceful life is limited because of the political environment, because of the societal environment pressure, and because of the life that I deserve to have. And then you come to this side of the world, and I am now in a place that is much more welcoming to me as a queer person, but I am still an immigrant. I'm still a person of color in a place that is struggling with white supremacy, struggling with xenophobia. So just my existence, just me walking in the street with my brown face, with my tattoos up and down my arms, I am telling a story, and that story is political just by its sense. So my personal is always going to be political. When I outline my work, before you write a book, you sit down and you outline everything. When I think of like 2004, for example, as a time period, and I want to write a story about 2004 as a time period in Damascus, I have to bring some research into this to see, politically speaking, where Syria, specifically in the Middle East generally, is at during that time, because that also informs the characters of my story. So with Penguin Random House, for example, I am contracted for 2 books, and they want a memoir for the second book. So I'm sitting there and I'm writing my memoir, and I had to do a lot of Googling to see back in 1984, the year that I was born, where was my mother and how was her life like? And I discovered that actually in the mid-70s, Syria started seeing, which is around the time that my mother was a teenager, Syria had a major shift politically and religiously, from a much more liberal society to a much more conservative society. And that was a time that is extremely formative for my mother, and explains, honestly, a lot of her behavior later on, a lot of who she is later on. So knowing that political background, knowing that my mother, when she was 14 or 15, she would go out in a mini Jeep and a revealing t-shirt and a big hair. And then when she was 17 or 18, she was forced into a freaking long jacket and a headscarf. That tells me a story about my mother. That tells me who she is as a human. So I think I'm going to summarize all of this by repeating, what is personal is always political.
And that art and politics are inextricably linked, aren't they? You are so informed by the political atmosphere, by your own personal politics. As you say, the personal is being political, and that comes out in art always.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. And like, think about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, just again, because the book is in the back of my head. There is a scene where the village is getting bigger and bigger, and they have their banana republic situation that is happening over there. And then a train track is being built. And then all of those people, white people with their big hats and weird outfits, start showing up to the village, and their arrival changed the way of the village's dynamics. The word colonization never actually comes into the book. The word occupation or labor laws or unions or whatever is a political term that you want to use never actually is appearing in the book. But the way that Gabriel Garcia Marquez shows the impact of the arrival of these folks into this village that was isolated and had its own dynamics is in a way political still.
Absolutely. Yeah, he doesn't have to say colonialism, does he?
No.
It's so deeply embedded in the actions and the text and the speech and everything.
In the narrative itself, yeah.
Yeah. So Suzanne asks, can you talk a bit about how you navigate between English and Arabic? In which languages do you write and think and dream? What Arabic literature inspires you?
And I think Sue also asked a similar question right after, do you write in Arabic or English? If both, how is it different? Or perhaps you just answered my question, I'm not at all. Thank you, Sue. I think that that question is extremely intellectual, so don't worry about it. I'm happy to answer it in a very intellectual way, promise. To both Suzanne and Sue, I say that I dream in color. I don't dream in languages, to be honest. Like if you ask me at 5 o'clock in the morning when I wake up, what language did I dream in? I will be like, I have no idea. I know that I dream in colors. I know that I dream in details. I know that I dream in conversations. So my dreams are big and magical, but there's always a conversation going on between the characters in my head, I guess. So dialogue is a big deal for me. Do I know what language they're having in those dialogues? I honestly can't tell you. I think it's their own language, those characters that live in my head. They have created their own language and now they're taking over. Wow. So as for writing, I published 2 collections of short stories in Arabic when I was living in the Middle East. So my first collection of short story came out when I was 19. And my second collection came out when I was 24. And people also called my my writing poetic, also called my writing lush and airy, and that I play a lot with magic realism. I think, and I read since I was young, I read both in Arabic and in English. So I think that I'm just inspired by the two, and I think that my drive, what I find beautiful, what I find lovely in writing, even when I'm writing dramatically, what I'm finding that is inviting in writing can be translated through different languages. So yeah, like I don't actually, when I wrote The Closed Line Swing, I wrote the whole thing in English. I didn't write it in Arabic and then translate it. When I wrote The Foghorn Echoes, I never actually tried to write in a language and then translate it to the other. And even if one day somebody decided, which is far-fetched, but if somebody decided to translate The Foghorn Echoes to Arabic or The Closed Line Swing to Arabic, I don't want to be that person who translates it. I don't want the two languages to melt in my head. I'm happy with the separation that is happening over there. As for the question of what inspires me in Arabic literature, I'm a big fan of the 80s and 90s in Arabic literature. I find it to have been quite influenced by the political upheaval during that time in the Middle East. I find it to be interested in the character development, interested in telling authentic stories, digging into emotions that are, I keep looking that way because that's my bookshelf. So I'm looking literally at my bookshelf for inspiration on how to answer this question. So yeah, I find it quite with depth. It has a lot of depth to it. I would say Radwa Ashur. She is my favorite author from the Arabia. She's Egyptian herself. She was Egyptian. She passed away 10 years ago or something, 5 years ago, around that time. I would say her most famous book and the one that got translated is called the Granada Trilogy. And that book is definitely worth your time. So I recommend highly to read the book. I would say that I'm also inspired by an author called Muhammad Mansi Qandil, which sadly is not translated, but he is quite masterful and also a magic realism kind of dude. So so that's a reason why I adore him. And maybe one day I'll translate his work for you all, but we'll see. Yeah, somebody's asking me to write down the names, and I'm happy to write down the names. Sure, 1 second, my friends, because I just clicked too many links at the same time. Yay, all the things that open. I have no idea. All right, so Radwa, sure. I'm not sure how to spell Granada, but here we are. Granada. I think that's how to spell it, but sure. So those are the names of the 2 authors that I mentioned here. There's literally, I can like flip the laptop, but then all of like, I have a ring light and shit, so all of that will fall apart. I can literally show you my collection, and I have a very small number of Arabic books here, which is extremely sad. But where would I buy Arabic books in Vancouver, BC? I was in Israel last May, no, the May before it. Oh God. I was in Israel a year and a half ago, and I walked into a bookstore that is an Arabic bookstore over there, and I ended up buying 48 books that day. And I had to haul them all the way back to Vancouver. My husband was not impressed. He was not impressed. I literally had to buy a new luggage to put all of those books in.
That sounds like a dream to me.
Talk to Matthew. He's the one who's still pissed about that.
Okay, so we have a question from Jim, who I think wants to ask it himself. So, Jim? Jim? Hi.
No, that's me.
Oh, that's you. Okay. I'll come back to Jim's question. But we have a question from Yasmin, and she asks, is your approach to writing memoir different from fiction?
I'll let you know. I never wrote memoir, and to be honest, I feel quite uncomfortable writing memoir. I'm extroverted, and I can like talk to you forever, like right now in front of people. But then the minute that this is over, I'll just like go hide under a blanket and watch TV, watch RuPaul's Drag Race for the rest of the night. But I'm extremely private, I think. So my approach to writing memoir is something that I am coming up with at the moment. I use some of my fiction tools, not to say that I'm writing fiction, but I use an outline to prepare for the memoir. I thought about the metaphor tree that I want to create for this memoir. I thought about a character development of sorts. So I want to tell, because you can always tell a good story. Think of every single biography movie you've ever seen, like Frida Kahlo, for example. I'm sure they picked and chose which parts of her life to show, and they might be extremely accurate and truthful, but they needed to create a character development, a hero's journey of sorts for Frida Kahlo in the movie. So I'm thinking about that as well. And maybe my agent is going to hate all of this and tell me to rewrite the whole thing, but we shall see. I'll let you know. Ask me again in a year.
Cool. It's interesting that you talk about the narrative, because, you know, as our lives are chronological, but, you know, things happen to us, as we mentioned before, like the fragmentation, and it doesn't necessarily, our memories don't come to us in that sort of like easily narrated time frame or timeline, does it? So good luck.
And that's the thing, like, I don't want to end up with one of those summary memoirs. I don't want to write a book where I did this, and then I did that, and then that person said this, and then that person said that. I want a memoir that has that beautiful rhythm that I try to create with my fiction, where you write a summary, set the scene, and then move into a dialogue, allow that dialogue to be impactful, and then move into like a moment of pause and reflection back into what actually happened. I think there's music to writing. I truly believe that, and a summary has a different tone than a dialogue. And literally, as you're writing a novel, you're writing a song, and the song has to be not only telling a good story, but also move with the music of the narrative, up and down.
You can so see the musical influences in the Clotheslines thing. In, you know, it's one of the questions I did want to ask, but it didn't make it to the cut of my question, was about feeling like you were creating this orchestra of cities and spaces and timelines. So it's really interesting to hear you say that music, to connect your writing with music in that way.
I have to say, like, just to answer your question that you never asked, I would say that truly, honestly, the best authors are authors who think musically about their narrative. If you wrote a book that is all summary, your reader is just going to be like monotonically reading throughout the book. If you wrote a book that is all like dialogue and people shouting at each other, your reader will be jumping up and down with you as the dialogue is moving. What you literally have to do with every book the best books that you read, I would say, are the books that take you in a journey, not only with the plot as a device, but also the way it's written as another device.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful way of looking at it. I think Jim is ready to answer or ask his question.
Let's go.
Hello. Can you hear me now? Hello?
I can, yes. I can.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, hi. Yeah, I'm Jim. So basically, I'm just wondering, on Monday, I'll be doing my first proper kind of like charity event, or however you'd like to call it. I'm going to be spending £1 a day for 3 weeks on food and drinks. And this is just to represent like how as a first worlder, I've always had enough money to buy whatever food I want. And I'm going to do this to try and raise money for this charity which we're working for. And I was just wondering, first of all, have you got any tips of how to market it to as many people as possible? And second, if you would like to get involved and try and help me with it and spread the word, I mean, it's for a great cause. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts. Yeah, go away.
Is the event happening on Monday, this Monday?
It'll be this Monday, me and at least 3 friends. I'm trying to persuade more people. Okay. We're just going to be going for it. It was really spontaneous. I decided like 2 days ago I'll do it, and then I thought I want to do something for quarantine. I'm feeling bad. Yeah, and I just want to help.
I applaud you for trying to help. That's very sweet, Jim. I think it's really fantastic to see folks who are driven to try to do something positive in the world, and the work of doing a charity is quite involved, I would say, because it requires you to be part of that cause, not only by wanting to support it, but by also understanding why that cause matters. So I'm very thankful that you think about these things and that you're pushing towards it. It's a bit of a short notice for me to join you on Monday. I have school to teach, and I have a journey to finish.
When I said for you to support on Monday, I meant more in the sense of like maybe share it or.
I'm happy to. I'm happy to.
Yeah.
Send it to Hanna, and I'll or like let Hanna tag me in it or something, and I will reshare it. That's for sure. Don't worry.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
And sorry, and then have you got any other advice for just general like marketing or just like getting? I just feel like sometimes a lot with like charity events or like crowdfunding sources or to sorry, I'm stuttering. To create money and to bring it in, I feel like often it's quite small, and if you don't know how to use the internet, I'm just a bit lost how to do it. So in your experiences, if you've ever had to like market your book, for example, what ways would you have gone through, and how did you figure it out?
Well, I published the Clothesline Swing, to be honest, with the smallest publishing house there is in Canada. Nightwood Editions is literally the smallest publishing house in Canada, in all of Canada. And I just hustled, honestly. Like, you shake every hand that you can shake. You talk to every person that you can talk to. You post on every social media outlet that you can. I bought for the Clothesline Swing, I bought 300 copies with my own money from my publisher. And then I bought 300 envelopes, and I Googled for 300 critics across North America. And I literally mailed 300 copies out to 300 critics, because I knew if 20 of them picked up that book and wrote a review about it, I have 20 reviews out. Otherwise, nobody would notice my book. I followed people on social media, on Twitter. I followed a famous anchor here, radio anchor called Carol Off, and I was like, "Hi, I'm a Syrian, and this is what I want to do, and here's my book. Can I send it your way?" And she was like, "Yeah, sure, no problem." And then a month later, she was like, "I read the book, I love it. I'm going to recommend it to CBC Books." And basically, what you do is what I did, I would say, and maybe that will inspire you, is that I believed in my art so freaking much because nobody else would. And that's the challenge with every marginalized author, be it a woman author, be it a person of color author, be it a queer or trans or two-spirit author, any author out there who's from a marginalized community. And I just said that to Hannah earlier. If you don't talk up yourself, who's going to? If you're not going to talk about how awesome you are, nobody else is going to. So my friend, my advice to you then is walk around with as much fake confidence as you can muster. Fake that confidence, friend, and have the ego of a freaking mountain, and just walk around and tell people how awesome it is that you can do the work that you can do.
All right.
I hope that was inspiring as much as I hope.
It gave me goosebumps. So yeah, pretty decent. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have somebody else, Rogelio. I think, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly.
Yes, my name is Rogelio. Let me open my camera. I'm sorry. So hi, I'm from the Philippines, but I'm based in London currently. My question is related to the language, because asylum seekers and refugees and those who fled their countries, they abandon a house, a home, a culture, a universe basically, and then move to another place on asking for a question, and eventually to be part of that community or another country. My question is related to the language, and because you said that you have 2 books previously published in Arabic, and can you share with us on how did you build the relationship with the English language, as English is not just a language but a culture, a universe, a world. And as someone who abandoned home and then trying to integrate into a new place, as a writer, and can you share with us your if you struggle and learning the language, because this is a completely different universe, especially if you are as you've said, a person of color or from a different culture, plus the layer of someone who has been displaced and trying to integrate into a new civilization, which is Western. Yeah.
Awesome.
And by the way, I have your book.
Awesome. I'll be happy to answer the question. So I learned English. I started learning English when I was 14 because I fell in love with Brian from the Backstreet Boys, and I wanted to know what the hell those boys are singing about. And I kid you not, that's literally how it happened. I fell in love with Brian from the Backstreet Boys. He was the cutest thing that ever walked the planet Earth. And Matthew actually looks like Brian from the Backstreet Boys. So that's in a way the universe answering my 14-year-old prayers, I guess. But then of course I got introduced to movies and musicals and all the gay things. And I fell in love with all of that. And I learned a lot about American culture through Hollywood, through movies, through TV shows. Which, to be honest, is the biggest lie there is. It is the worst way to actually, you learn a lot about the language. You definitely learn to say things like chasing pavements when you want to say that you're walking without intention where you're going to, or you learn the cues. You learn the you can take a horse to the water, but you can't force a horse to drink. You learn those kind of things. But that doesn't mean that you understand anything about the North American or Western society. You just know the superficial stories that Hollywood is trying to do. When I arrived here to Canada, my biggest knowledge about Canada was a TV show called The Little House on the Prairies, a sitcom called The Little House on the Prairies. And literally I'm walking around being like, why nobody is funny here? I just assumed that everybody would just be like cracking jokes, talking to each other, because you don't have any other way of learning anything about North American context or Western context other than TV and music and movies. So I would say my biggest struggle, to be honest, during my first year here was understanding those social cues, understanding who these people are, because who I am as a person from Syria is completely different than somebody who's Syrian, who's born here, or somebody who is white, who's born here, or the experience of, so I'm a gay man of color from Syria, immigrant, came here to Canada, to Vancouver in 2014. And my experience will be extremely different from a gay woman of color from Syria who came to Canada in 2014. There are different ways that our life work based on who we are, based on the intersectionality of who we are as people. And I would say that my biggest challenge was to understand my own position in this new society, as well as to understand that new society and their own social cues. I don't know if that will translate, but in Vancouver, one of the very first icebreakers between two people who just met each other is that they talk about the weather. Vancouver is a very rainy city, and half an hour later it's going to be very sunny, and then 2 hours later it's snowing all over the place. It's just Vancouver has a very temperamental weather, I guess. So people just talk about the weather. It's topic of icebreaker. It's totally normal. In Syria, given that Damascus, the weather, it's hot in the summer, it's cold in the winter. It doesn't change. The social cue is when you talk about the weather, you're telling the other person that you don't actually have interest in having this conversation with them. So for a year, I kept going to social events, meeting new people. Everybody's talking to me about the weather. And then I go back home and I'm like, nobody likes me here. Nobody wants to talk to me. Nobody finds me interesting. It's just because there's this culture clash. And this is literally the silliest example of culture clashes between Syrians and Canadians. There's so much that is a culture clash that happens between the two sides. And the only way that you can get over those culture clashes is to navigate this world with curiosity. The people who were talking to me about the weather are just lost in translation. They didn't mean to harm me in any way, shape, or form. So, and me and the way that I understood them, which resulted in me shutting down and getting away from them, I'm also lost in translation. I didn't mean to harm myself or the others. So I think the way that really helped me is to be very curious and ask questions. So why are we talking about the weather right now? and B, just like explain it to me. Like a lot of times for the first year or two in my life here in Canada, when someone says something, a word that I've never heard before, I'd be like, cool. But now I'm totally comfortable with being like, I don't know this word, can you explain it to me? And there's completely nothing wrong with that. Again, I speak 2 whole other languages other than English, and most of the people around me speak English. So there's no challenge in any way in saying, oh, I don't know this specific word, can you help? I hope that answered your question. I feel like I went into a random train of thoughts. I end up sometimes in a random train of thoughts.
Thank you for answering the question though, Danny. Thank you.
All right.
Do we have time for any more questions? Or I could ask you questions all evening, but I think maybe it's time for us to wrap up.
It's up to you. You have asked me for an hour and a half, and you still have a good 10-15 minutes. I'm happy to be here for more. It's up to you.
Okay, I don't think there's any questions from the audience, but I've got one question that I didn't include in my questions that I sent to you, but I've been burning to ask, and that's about food in the book. And there's just so much talk about food and delicious recipes and cooking, and tell me about it.
Actually, it's something that my agent brought into my intention, because apparently I talk a lot about Syrian cuisine in my fiction and in my short stories, and in my children's book is literally called Salma the Syrian Chef. So apparently I talk a lot about cuisine, and for somebody who doesn't actually know how to cook, I really talk about it quite a lot. And the Foghorn Echoes, like, I intentionally didn't have a mention of food over there, just because I don't want to be just the author who writes about food all the time. I don't know. I honestly don't know what to say about that, or why I had that obsession for a couple of years with food. I think food speaks to a language, to a culture. I think it speaks to a climate. So food from Syria is very sour. It's heavy on the, I'm like my mouth is watering. It's heavy on citrus flavors, because we had a lot of like citrus trees, like lemon and oranges, and they work quite well in our environment. We have also a lot of olive trees, so you end up with a lot of olive oil and olives and different kinds of olives. So I think it tells a story. Food tells a story, not just about what you're eating, but also the culture that it represents, I think.
And there's such a sensory story that you're telling as well, like the olive oil that was poured onto the sandwiches that the mother gives to the narrator as a kid, and the mint covered lebna, and the scrambled eggs with the flour added, and it's sort of collecting everything on the table, isn't it? And the breakfast and the fruit cellar. There's so much sensory information that I just loved. So.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Again, honestly, no idea why I had that focus on food for a couple of years, and maybe I'll write you a cookbook one day. It would be fun for somebody who doesn't know how to cook.
Well, Sue asks, what food do you miss most?
Oh, all of it. That's a difficult question. I can answer it simply by saying I miss McDouce, which is stuffed eggplants getting stuffed with nuts and chili pepper, and then they get pickled for 6 months at a time in olive oil, not in water. So they become so delicious and full of flavors. And I ended up actually writing Salma the Syrian Chef because one day I woke up with this like desire to have a Syrian brunch, just like the lebne with the mint and the olive oil, and the makdous with the eggplants and the olive oil, and the full shami, which is the dish that Salma ends up making in the book. And for me to do that in Syria and Damascus, I literally walk down out of the building into the supermarket next door, buy everything I needed, and come back home and I make it. It's half an hour done. For us to be able to actually accomplish this in Vancouver, it took 5 different people traveling to 5 different parts of the city to each grab 1 or 2 items, ended up gathering all of those things, and then it took us a good hour and a half just to like gather the ingredients, and then half an hour for me to cook. So what started as a brunch ended up as a lunch. It just it tells you a story of this nostalgia. It tells you a story of the change of culture, of the change of accessibility, I guess, to how accessible it is for me to be just a Syrian dude and just live my good Syrian life, I guess.
And that sort of real sense of longing and taste and flavor, just needing it.
Yeah.
So we have one last question I think we've got time for, and it's from Jim again, and I think he wants to ask it himself.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Hello again. Yeah, so I was just wondering, maybe for about 2 years ago, I'm kind of a bit communist, and I was thinking.
I think Jim is having
I believe in money. I didn't like the idea of money, and I just.
I'm sorry, Jim. I can't hear a single word you said, my friend. You had some.
Hello. Is it better?
Over there.
Is it better now?
Hello?
Can you type it down? Is that okay with you? Do you think? There we go. Well, I'm actually quite happy to see all of you today here, and I see that nobody left the conversation early, which says that I'm still an engaging speaker.
Very much so.
I get people to talk. I try my very best. Thank you, Karen. Karen's giving me that thumbs up. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for all of you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Right. So Richard Williams is asking, our local university, the University of Sussex, has just completed a big research project into asylum claims based on sexual orientation. If this is not too personal a question, and feel free to ignore this if not, did you claim asylum based on your sexual orientation? Can the asylum procedure be improved in that perspective? Yes, I did claim asylum and came here to Canada based on my sexual orientation. There's an organization here in Canada called Rainbow Refugee Society, and that organization took advantage of a program that I don't know if it's available anywhere else in the world. We have a program offered by the Canadian government called Private Sponsorship Program, in which you and me, anybody who's Canadian, if you manage to get 5 people together to agree to privately sponsor a refugee, you just fill out an application, you submit the application to the government, and the government then brings that person to you. So literally, me and like, I do it now for work as part of my advocacy, is that I find 5 people, I put them together in a group, I get them to do some like work, collaborative work, raise some funds, and then I put them in touch with somebody back in the Middle East, and they just literally whisk that person over in a couple of years and bring them here. And the Canadian government facilitates the whole thing. It's quite straightforward. And that's how I ended up being here. So 5 different Canadian citizens had it in their heart to put together a sponsorship group, and I was privately sponsored, and after the application was submitted by 2 years, because it takes time for the application to be processed, I arrived here to Canada. Do I think the process in Canada can be improved? Of course I do. Do I think that other Western countries should do the same, namely the UK and the US? Yes, please do the same. That would be fun, I think. And I still have, of course, my critiques on the process for private sponsorship here in Canada. Mainly because there's no priority for folks from marginalized identities. So somebody who is in a refugee camp who might be surrounded by homophobic folks will not get priority over somebody who's just sitting home and waiting for their application to be processed, which I think is kind of bullshit. Also, the private sponsors are never they never have to submit any documentation about themselves, which means that anybody can privately sponsor anybody, which means that somebody who has a criminal record or somebody who has ulterior motives might have power over somebody else coming from the other side of the world. So yeah, I think there's a lot of critique to be offered to the private sponsorship program. But at the same time, I think Canada is by far one of the very few countries that actually actively seek to support immigrants and refugees like myself. All right.
I'm not sure if we've got enough time to answer any more questions, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you've got like a 2-minute answer to Jim's question about the role of money or the power of money.
I think I don't know if I have a 2 minutes answer to that. That's a very big question to be answered in 2 minutes. However, I appreciate that you're thinking about those things, Jim. I think definitely it's a dive into some theories about the power of money and the relationship between who is responsible for giving the money and the work that grassroots organizations are doing. I think there's a lot of research has been done on that, so you can definitely seek that online.
Thank you.
Mm.
So that brings tonight's lovely event to a close. Thank you so much, Danny. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And thank you for your warmth and for sharing so much of your experience in your work with us. It's been amazing. I'm going to pass back over to Jacob for a couple of concluding remarks, but just wanted to say thank you.
Before Jacob, thank you so much, Hannah. That was a lovely event. I really appreciate it. I also had a lot of fun. You folks are a fantastic group of folks, and I'll come to Brenton one day. Now, all of you, please and thank you, support this cause. This cause is really important. So I think Jacob is about to say much about that, so I'll leave that to Jacob.
Yeah, but thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Danny, and thank you, everyone. Do get Danny's book, The Clothesline Swing. It's worth reading. The Foghorn. What's the new title?
The Foghorn Echoes.
The Foghorn Echoes is out 2022. Is that right? So keep your eyes for that. Get your kids Selma the Syrian Chef, or read it yourself. It's really a great book. And thank you for coming. I'm very bad at wrapping things up, but I was thinking just about food, partly because it's dinner time, but also because we're talking about food. And a few years ago, I saw Jean Binta Breeze, the Jamaican poet, speak, and she claimed, I think rightly, that the 4 great pillars of civilization are art, science, sport, and cooking. And I think one thing about food is that although it's both of a place, it knows no boundaries and crosses them beautifully. So I think, like, in food, in cuisine, in a meal, every time there's a plate in front of you, there's a challenge to the border, to those that think that the local, the specific, must stay in one place. and it belongs in one place. Whereas instead, of course, we have a world, the world that I live in and the world that we do live in, the world that we need to work together to make a political reality, I think is a world in which the specific is also global and crosses those boundaries. And that in the end, that's what 1,000 for 1,000 I think is about. It's, of course, it's a charity and it's trying to house people, but it's also trying through the act of getting the community together to share a small amount of money each month, the price of a piece of cake or what have you, to bring home. It's trying to mobilize that community to create a world of welcome where difference is celebrated, where the individual is prioritized against this work. We're working together so that we can fulfill our our creative and culinary potentials. So do, if you can, support 1,000 for 1,000. Do come to the next event if you want. It hopefully will be on the 22nd of December. A conversation between Francis Webber of the Institute of Race Relations and Jana, I'm afraid I don't know his surname, of the Tamil Welfare Association of Newham, talking about the history of, or the recent history, the last kind of 40 years or so of refugee policy in the UK and how that's changed with something and how they've resisted it. Some incredible stories. So look out for that. We'll be sending everyone the link. Yes, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Hannah. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Danny. Thank you, Jacob. Good night.